program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the Eau Claire Area School Board.
All right, we'll call the meeting to order. Thank you for those of you, that are joining us online, and those of you that are invited presenters tonight joining us here in person. Maida, can you confirm that we are in compliance with open meeting laws? Thank you. And if you will call the roll, please.
Commissioner Johnson?
Here.
Commissioner Lyons?
Here. Here.
Commissioner Zur?
Here.
Commissioner Bika?
Here.
Commissioner Clements?
Here.
Commissioner Harder?
Thank you. We'll now move on to our Pledge of Allegiance. Our student pledge leader tonight is Lydia F. Lydia is a 5th grader at Manz Elementary. When she is not working hard at school, you'll find Lydia playing soccer, participating in Girl Scouts, and being an awesome little sister and spending time with the family and her cat, Ninja. Lydia is an excellent representation of who our Manz Mustangs are, both at school and in our community. And I will say, from a personal level, I find Ninja to be a great name for a cat. So thank you for being here tonight, Lydia. As Lydia comes forward to lead us, those of you who are willing and able, please rise and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the adoption of tonight's agenda. I would hear a motion to adopt the agenda for this evening. So moved. Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Next order of business on the agenda is our recognitions for the evening, and I will turn it over to Superintendent Johnson.
Good evening, Chair Nordine, board members, student representatives, executive team, and distinguished guests. We have 2 of them tonight. First of all, Manz Club Invention. 20 students in our 4th and 5th grade at Manz Elementary have signed up to participate in our Club Invention program. Club Invention is an innovative after-school option for students based on STEM-focused activities and challenges that encourage imagination and build team-based problem-solving skills. Our Club Invention problem solvers will be tackling the theme of SOS, Endangered Earth, where students save homes of animals from across the country through the lens of human-generated threats. Students will create clever ways to build safe animals, spaces, and protect our species diversity. So we have Mr. Keaton here tonight, and when I get done with the second one, we'll have Mr. Keaton and our next person come up for recognition when we're completed with both of them. So thanks, Mr. Keaton, to Manz Elementary. Secondly, middle school Q1 sports. The middle school principals wish to highlight a successful first season of our athletic programs. We thank our middle school families for their support, the coaches for building relationships and sharing their love and knowledge of the game, and our assistant principals and middle school athletic director for their dedication and commitment. Most importantly, our middle school student athletes who choose to learn and grow throughout the season. Middle school athletics serve as an extension of the school day to provide students with meaningful relationships, a safe environment, fundamental skills, and competitive experiences. We're proud to share that our Q1 athletic season, including football, volleyball, cross country, girls tennis, and boys soccer, served a total of 841 middle school students. To provide context, 46.2% of our district's grade 7 and 8 students chose to join a first quarter athletic team. In addition, 132 grade 6 students competed in cross country. A sincere thank you to all who were involved in making this possible for our students. And we'd like Assistant Principal Justin Jablonski at North Star Middle to join us. So at this point, I'll bring the 2 certificates up. We'll get pictures with both Principal Keaton at Manz and Assistant Principal and AD Justin Jablonski. Sure. Justin, appreciate it. Yeah. Again.
At this time, we move on to our public forum. The board provides time for community members to address the board. at each meeting. Each speaker is allowed up to 4 minutes to address the board. The board does not hear personal complaints of school personnel nor any person connected with the school system in a public forum. I will remind our speakers this includes students as well as staff members and any others connected with the district. Our first speaker tonight is Lori Plackey-Worth.
Call-in users, a link to unmute has been sent. If you're Lori, please unmute and go ahead for public comment. President Nordine, it doesn't look like Lori's here.
All right, if you get an indication that she happens to show up before the end of public comment, that's fine, we can come back. Next, we will move on then to Maggie Venable.
Maggie, go ahead.
I'm sorry, it started talking to me. That was weird. The Eau Claire Area School District DPI school report card ranking among all Wisconsin's districts in the 2015-2016 school year was 57%. In 2018-2019, ECASD dropped to 26%. That puts ECASD 1 percentage point away from the bottom quarter of 464 school districts in the state. ECASD has fallen from exceeding expectations to now simply meeting expectations. When we have incoming third graders who can only read a book by making up words from the pictures on the page, we have a problem in ECASD. When we have high school students getting A's in their AP courses, but they cannot pass the AP exam, we have a problem in ECASD. When parents get told their children's math homework isn't graded on accuracy, but graded on effort, we have a problem in ECASD. When parents get told their children can redo an assignment or retake an exam as many times as needed because we want to teach children putting in effort gets a better result, that's not preparing our kids for college or for a job. We have a problem in ECASD. When falling behind the state score on closing gaps, we have a problem in ECASD. When only 43% of tested students are at or above proficient level for ELA and 48% for math, we have a problem in ECASD. We have over 100 open staffing positions, yet the surrounding districts are full. We have a problem in ECASD. The academic decline of the Eau Claire Area School District is real. Parents listening to meeting after meeting, we hear all the data that is presented showing our kids are declining. We give public comment, we send email after email, most of which are ignored. Yet there's never anything added to an agenda or any discussion on making changes to improve academics. I even remember Commissioner Zier asking to see literacy rate data back at a June board meeting, and I don't believe that that has ever been presented. It seems you all are satisfied with managing our district's decline. You continue to defend the policies that have led us to where we are today, and to make matters worse, you've actually doubled down on many of those policies, which have resulted in the deterioration of so much more than academics, which staff and parents have to deal with every day. I ask you all to change course. Please put aside being our children's healthcare provider, our children's social justice warrior, our children's energy consumer, monitor, and focus on making sure every child is learning, getting to proficient levels, and college ready. Our children need a quality education. Our parents and all of their concerns need to be heard and addressed. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Did not see Ms. Plackey-Worth having joined us, so we will move on to our final public speaker of the night, Mark Goings.
You've been unmuted, Mark. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Mark Goings. I live at E17450 County Road V in Augusta, Wisconsin. Excuse me. In a time when so much related to COVID is up in the air and new obstacles seem to emerge on a regular basis, supports like tonight's COVID Day language are so important. And I personally would like to thank Superintendent Johnson, the executive team, and district leaders for their work on this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. That ends our public forum for the evening. We'll now move on to our reports. Commissioner Lyons has informed me that budget development will meet in the next 2 weeks in order to continue talking about the referendum and other issues. So we will get a report from them at the next meeting. We'll go straight on to our legislative liaison, Dr. Johnson.
Senate Bill 454, a massive overhaul of the reading readiness program, including new state mandates related to screening, assessments, interventions, parental notification, and reporting requirements, has passed both houses of the state legislature this week and now heads to Governor Evers to either be signed into law or vetoed. The Wisconsin Association of School Boards opposes this bill on local control grounds because it is very prescriptive, largely unfunded, new assessment schemes that would require districts to scrap their current efforts no matter how much promise and/or results they are achieving. On October 21st, the Department of Public Instruction released statewide testing results showing the significant impact of the pandemic and school closures had on test participation and proficiency rates. The results are from the Wisconsin Student Assessment System exam administered to students in spring 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the superintendent's consent agenda. For both consent agendas, the board acts with one vote without discussion. Each item has been discussed at a previous meeting or the board has been furnished background information. Tonight's superintendent's consent agenda consists of the human resources report, employment report, approved transportation contract, 2020-21 budget adjustments, gifts in the amount of $6,215.16 for the period of September 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2021. Payment of all bills in the amount of $6,278,628.28 and net payroll in the amount of $2,985,516.58 for the period of August 1st, 2021 through August 31st, 2021. Payment of all bills in the amount of $6,750,796.54 and net payroll in the amount of $3,610,947.72 for the period of September 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2021. I would hear a motion to approve the superintendent's consent agenda.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Maida, if you would please conduct a roll call vote.
Commissioner Johnson,
Yes.
Commissioner Lyons,
Yes.
Commissioner Nordin,
Yes.
Commissioner Zur,
Yes.
Commissioner Bika,
Yes.
Commissioner Clements.
Yes.
We'll now move on to the board's consent agenda. The board consent agenda includes minutes of board meeting October 18th, 2021 and minutes of budget hearing October 25th, 2021. I would hear a motion to approve the board's consent agenda.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Thank you. We'll now move on to monitoring district results. Tonight we have the first draft of our monitoring report for OE6 personnel administration. We all are getting used to at this point. Our first drafts are the opportunity for the board and the administration, specifically Superintendent Johnson, to discuss proposed indicators and necessary evidence, as well as interpretations of the board's policy. So at this time, I will turn it over to Superintendent Johnson to walk us through his interpretations and first draft of OE6.
Thank you. I look forward to going over OE6. I leaned heavily on Executive Director of HR, K. Marks on this, but we also may have a couple other folks from our executive team that may weigh in. There's some history there with surveys and other types of things. There are 15 subheadings for OE6. I'd like to probably just take no more than 10 to 15 minutes and then be able to get plenty of comments, questions. But we leaned heavily, or I leaned heavily when we looked at these on Racine, Sun Prairie, DeForest, and in a couple instances, Chippewa Falls had some interesting things to note and add to it. So we'll just start with 6.1 with the superintendent will. Creating and maintaining that organizational culture that demonstrates our core values. They're listed there. The board expects me to maintain that organizational culture that exemplifies the values. And then I defined organizational culture, used a couple different definitions. Like I said, I think on that one, looked at 2 or 3 of those 4 I mentioned previously. The first indicator, 50% or more staff will complete our annual staff climate survey. And the second was that percent continues to increase every year. The second one, to recruit, select, retain, and promote the most highly qualified and diverse candidates for all positions. This was fairly similar in the other, maybe a little bit different in some, but for the most part, that was a consistent, I should say, subheading of everyone's personnel management. But the indicators for this one, 100% of our staff are highly qualified as defined by DPI. This is the one where, Kay would be able to define certain things. She's had plenty of experience here in the district. 100% of our employees have the licenses required for the position they're assigned to work. The internal processes for hiring, those inputs, including those 4 following indicators, the examples there. And then I know that HR department has that evidence as well. Moving on to number 3, develop an emergency succession plan for key departmental leaders that provides for continuity of services on an interim basis. It's very similar to my own superintendent succession plan. Never comfortable talking about that, but we must. We value leadership. The board values the leadership. We need to maintain the continuity of services for our students, staff, and families. This has not, if we were just to say this right now, this is not compliant. We have not done such an exercise. But after the meeting today, we'll talk about an executive team tomorrow. We have 2 principals as part of that meeting. We would discuss these and how we would go about doing so. So anyway, the positions would be all our executive directors as well as our building principals. For 6.4, employee complaints, how do we effectively handle them? The board, you expect me to respond to those complaints in timely and professionally and keeping things confidential. The indicators for that, after a couple of the definitions, would be 100% of those formal complaints and grievances results in no violation of district policy procedure or employee handbook language. We want to make sure we're following that process. The second indicator is the formal written complaints and grievances are resolved and handled in accordance with our policy as well. And then third, that we're trained in effectively / legally resolving complaints, conflicts, and concerns. For 6.5, ensuring our systems that maintain accurate, up-to-date, and comprehensive job descriptions for our positions. The board expects me to review, modify, working very closely with HR, but also all of our people in charge of hiring at the building level as well. We want those to be reviewed, updated regularly. So the first indicator, they're reviewed and updated prior to posting and were available to applicants during the hiring process. And the second one is they're reviewed regularly on a rotating schedule. When vacancies do arise with each executive director, make sure they're up to date and they're aligned to the departmental goals and essential functions. For 6.6, protecting confidentiality, anything regarding personnel, you expect me to have that responsibility to safeguard our employee records and keep those matters confidential. For that one, just 2 indicators. Any documented reports of breach of confidentiality by HR staff have been thoroughly investigated and appropriate action taken. The second indicator is a bit different. by any ECASD staff member. The first one being very specific to HR, the second with our staff in general, and appropriate action taken. For 6.7, this is very interesting, going through all the different, for example, DeForest, Racine, Sun Prairie, in different, metro or metropolitan areas. Compensation and benefit plans to attract and retain highest quality employees by looking at marketplace, but also looking at comparable size and type to the extent permitted by available resources, and even getting information from, let's say, Chippewa Falls as well, how they measure things regionally. So anyway, you expect me to implement that compensation benefit plan that positions us to recruit, hire, and retain the most highly qualified employees. Some indicators here: cycle for the review of market studies developed for each employee group. The second one is we're competitive and within salary and compensation plan ranges compared to market for positions in region and across the state, and then in areas of typical or similar enrollment as well. Third indicator, our average salaries and wages and compensation plans for all other employee groups are benchmarked to the market to confirm competitiveness. The next one, 6.8, ensuring that evaluation processes are performed annually in accordance with procedures and guidelines by DPA and district policy. For these indicators, all eligible personnel are evaluated as outlined by DPI at effectiveness system. And the second one, the same, all licensed school and district level admin evaluated annually is outlined by DPI, and may include consideration of goal achievement and reasonable progress of future governance monitoring reports. That was something that I had shared, or I had added, because once we get going with our coherent governance, we may want to place that in our evaluation systems. For the third indicator, all other employees receive an annual eval, and the same thing may include consideration of goal achievement and reasonable progress on future governance monitoring reports. For the ninth, ensure the PD and necessary training are provided for all staff to be highly qualified and trained in best practice, to be able to have them perform at their assigned responsibilities. And then the indicators, 100% of our certified staff are highly qualified, defined by DPI. Our onboarding procedures provide that necessary training. Third, staff development for primary initiatives. Four, we're compliant with mandated training. And fifth, all new certified staff provided with a mentor. And then 6.10, communicating pertinent district information with staff in a timely and appropriate manner. We want to be able to communicate out to our staff and they feel that they're informed. The first indicator is an employee relations committee makes fewer than 3 suggestions to refine the language based on confusion of staff over rules and procedures in any given year. The second indicator is a deadline. By the 31st of each calendar year, we've had acknowledged that they've received and read updated policies and employee handbook. And then third, new handbook language is reviewed for clarity by the ERC. Then working collaboratively with district staff to develop a system in which to measure climate and culture of our district. That's something the board values. For the 3 indicators, conducting employee engagement survey a minimum of once a year. Our building and district office department leaders annually develop those plans based on our employee engagement survey feedback. And then formal complaints, especially the hostile work environment or harassment, they're substantiated, acted on very quickly and appropriately to remedy that matter. The next, I believe, 5, the next 4, they're the superintendent may not without board approval. We've seen that once before in our OEs. But the superintendent may not without board approval make changes to the employee handbook. With the indicators here, 100% of those changes have to be met with board approval. Fairly straightforward. For 13, the superintendent may not without board approval make changes to the employee compensation plan, including benefits. Again, changes to employee economic benefits are made with board approval or utilization of coherent governance. 14, I may not change my own compensation. Makes sense there. Any changes would be made with adherence to HR protocols and subsequent board approval, not and or. And 15, I may not promise or imply guaranteed employment which can't be terminated with notice. All employment recs are made with adherence to HR department protocols and subsequent board approval. Those four were very similar in 3 of the 4 previous school districts I mentioned. So that was, as the board developed these policies, you could kind of tell, but it was really interesting to go through, especially those 4, but those 4 at the end, 12 through 15, but 3 of the 4 had very similar language. So that's what I hope to accomplish, to get that done within about 10 minutes. I know there will be some robust conversation, questions, comments, and I'm really looking forward to this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. You can tell by just the number of bullet points that this is one of the policies that the board was focused on. And of course, we've had lots of conversation about making sure that our employees are treated well and have an environment that they can flourish for the benefit, of course, of student results. At this time, I'll open the floor to comments or questions from our board members or our student representatives.
In full disclosure, I did want to share with the board, I did receive a couple of questions today from board members. I had the chance to meet with Kay Marks today about 4 o'clock for a brief time. And then there were a couple things I needed a little bit more help on. She had a meeting till 5. We were able to connect. So I provided some of those, but if we want to discuss those, that's fine too. I just wanted to share that with all board members in case you didn't have a chance to check your email in the last 2.5 hours.
Commissioner Clements.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. Rita, can you go up to 6.2, please? Front. This is one of the items that was in the correspondence today, but the item refers to recruit, select, retain, and promote the most highly qualified and diverse candidates. So the proposed measures identify credentials as a qualification, but they don't refer to any other ways to measure how employees are qualified. And typically those credentials are often minimum qualifications, not exclusively, I would expect, but often are minimum. How we propose to try to quantify other characteristics of qualification that our staff may display in terms of determining and tracking how we're doing as a district on this intent.
What I can share, and I will ask Executive Director Marks to speak a little bit to some history and types of initiatives with this. But for example, with let's say with principal hires or executive director hires, but I could go back to the positions that we had open when I was able to be part of that process a 1.5 years ago over the summer. Before I started and right after I started, we were interviewing folks, and it was in talking with Executive Director Marks about the recruiting, but as well as, how many diverse candidates would we be able to interview? And to whom did we reach out? Which types of underrepresented groups, or did we use certain types of, certain types of structures? And then reporting that out. One thing I did appreciate when I started here is I did notice that, when we had those types of principal hires or administrative hires, that we would share. Here were the number of applicants, here were the number of candidates, and it was broken down in a variety of measures. But it was interesting to talk with Executive Director Marks about what are some of the opportunities that the district uses to recruit. So I wanted to share that to be able to provide that data. And maybe that part of that would be in evidence, Commissioner Clements. But it certainly could be where I could add to the indicator to make it a little bit more robust so that there could be one just on recruitment, or it could be on selection, or it could be on retaining, but with, I guess, a little bit different language. Executive Director Marks, would you be able to answer some of that question that Commissioner Clements had?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, so in terms of like in the past, what we have done, obviously prior to COVID, there were some pretty significant initiatives regarding, districts going out to recruitment fairs. And specifically in our district, there's been, as you know, a great focus from the board's level of diversity when it comes to recruitment. And so there's been several years prior to being in Safer at Home where the push has been, us going out to recruitment fairs in other areas, both in Wisconsin, out of Wisconsin, close to home, far away from home, trying to open up the Eau Claire area school district to a more diverse population of employees, and not just teachers, but across the board. And routinely, I would say that those efforts have been futile in our attempt to try to recruit people to come to Eau Claire, which I believe is why we've wound up, like I would say, prior to the equity statement, the work that we had done on the policy committee with, I know, Commissioner Clemens and President Nordine and Commissioner Johnson, the work that we had been doing with policy 511 leading up to the equity statement and all of the focus we had put into recruitment of diverse candidates at that point was actually kind of a reaction to the fact that as we have tried those different recruitment efforts, bring people to us, they hadn't been fruitful. And so I think it was bringing the awareness that number one, there's in the world of education, not a lot of applicants to choose from, period, regardless of the diversity, because that keeps diminishing each year. But then when you add that diversity piece on top of it, it became more challenging. And so then it was, okay, what else can we do if people aren't attracted to our area? And so those were the pieces that we were looking at that point in time, just prior to the board taking on an equity statement initiative. So I think that there's a lot of layers that go into this, because it's not as simple as just saying, well, we're going to go to this recruitment fair or this event, and suddenly we're going to be attractive to diverse candidates. That's a climate and culture issue, which everybody on the board knows, which is why you've taken such a great stance on working to make changes here in the district and the community. So I think we're on the right track, but that's going to take some time.
Dr. Bika.
So I really appreciate everything that Ms. Marks has said, and I know that it's this is something you've been giving account of the recruitment efforts for the years that I've been on the board. So I'm most appreciative. I wonder if now is the time we need a commitment to this OE, and even if we're not successful, I'd like us to have an explicit commitment here, not just about recruitment, but about hiring. And even if we fall short, and maybe the indicators are something a little bit different. Maybe it's more about how we begin working with schools in the UW system. Maybe it's a different kind of indicator than we talked about before. If you have people that are coming for the education program at UW Eau Claire, can we capitalize on that? or the other UWs, which is something different than what we've been doing, but I would really like us to make that commitment now. It's documented.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Commissioner Clements.
Thank you, President Nardine. I agree with Commissioner Bika on that matter, you know. Similar to some of the other OEs, we're setting goals that we understand, I think are not those that are going to be gimmies. You know, we're looking for how do we set goals that are determining direction and creating accountability in a way that we're stretching to achieve them. And while my initial question was a little bit broader than diversity in recruitment and retention, but those are key ones that are part of that as well. But you know, I think that's something we should track, report on, and include as an indicator of how we're doing. But my question also included other qualifications, you know, but beyond a teaching credential, for example. Like how are we tracking and reporting how we're doing in terms of overall recruitment and retention? You know, key characteristics. I don't know what those characteristics are. I'm not sure what else we're tracking. But clearly, when we have an applicant pool, everyone should meet the minimum qualifications to get hired. But what other qualifications are we tracking that are desirable that may be related to performance, either on the hiring side or over time? Because retention is part of this as well. So, you know, what things are we measuring to say that we're doing a good job retaining our most qualified staff and faculty, and what are we doing to continue to improve those staff persons in terms of ways that we can measure?
I think before I toss it back over to, I would think, and I'm thinking back to WeCan on what WeCan can easily pull, and I think bilingual, if a staff member is bilingual, or if an applicant is that something easily pulled with a, I mean, it's another level to a qualification, as well as, let's say, a nationally board certified person if we were to interview him or her.
We ask for additional information. That's a voluntary part of the process that WeCan itself doesn't, but we do here in the district as part of our tracking process for diverse candidates. So again, it's voluntary on applicants, and so people don't have to answer it. I would say that, I can't give you an exact number, but I'm going to say as many more applicants choose to participate in answering the question than those that don't. So I would say that it's probably going to be beneficial for us tracking, even though it is voluntary thing that they can participate in that piece. The other piece I think, Mr. Clemens, that you're asking about is not the recruitment piece, but maintaining our employees once we have them. So there's obviously, through our supervision and evaluation process, you know, we have a whole system in place in terms of how that looks, what's expected of employees. As employees are falling short, their supervisors work with them. When it gets to a point that the supervisor needs assistance working with them, then they reach out to me. I provide supervisor assistance in supervising the employee. And we work through coaching and mentoring, trying to get that employee to be highly qualified, is what you're saying. And sometimes we're able to do that, and we coach that employee up, and we get to the point they are highly qualified, which doesn't have anything to do, like you said, with a credential or a license. But in our world, be highly qualified from an evaluation standpoint. And then there's other times where it just simply doesn't work, and we've tried everything we can do to help them be successful, and we determine that they're not highly qualified to be able to work with our students or meet the needs of our district. And in those cases, we work with the employee to, you know, phase them out of the position. So in those cases, I would say that we've seen that they're not highly qualified to work in the district, and then the evidence of that would be that we've phased them out of the position. And I have all of that information. That's tracked every year.
We're still yours.
Thank you. So as a follow-up, I think this has been a question I've had, not just with this OE, but I know, I guess, less about how this functions than perhaps some of the others is, you know, for many of these, we're thinking about variables that we're already tracking, which is great because that means it's already there. We just need to figure out how to report it and what does it mean. But I'm also thinking about what things do we care about that we might not be measuring, and it should start or try to figure out how to measure it. For example, various places I've worked over time, there's been voluntary training on supervision or voluntary training on, you know, a certain number of hours of DEI that staff can take or may be expected to take every year. Are there opportunities like that we're tracking, you know, from our faculty or staff? For example, perhaps principals or others with supervisory duties have the opportunity to pursue, you know, those kind of opportunities that advance their training. It may not necessarily yield the outcome in terms of proficiency, but is at least an indicator that they're receiving some sort of training. And if those things exist, how can we track and report on those? Let's just say a certain percentage of principals completed this core battery of training, for example. Are there things like that we can also include as indicators for this? Some, you know, maybe this particular OE or somewhere else in this chapter?
Superintendent Johnson, did you want me to comment on that piece?
Sure.
Okay. So I will coach this as saying prior to COVID, like we say with so many things, simply because that just kind of turned our world upside down and a lot of things changed. So prior to COVID, the executive team had been working with new principals, new what we call hiring managers, basically anybody who has supervisory evaluative authority over anybody, and work with those individuals on the things that you're speaking about, Commissioner Clemens. And so each month was different topics, and to bring those folks in and meet with them and say, this is how we do this, and this is how you work with employees on that. And if you struggle in this area, this is what the expectations are, and this is who you reach out to. And so, I mean, it was an in-house training program that was designed to meet the needs of ECASD. It wasn't something where, you know, it's something through, you know, JJ Keller or whatever. It was in-house, built to meet the needs of our district. And that had been going on in some way, shape, or form for probably the last 7 years, prior to, you know, COVID. And so we're in the process of rebirthing that and doing so with some modifications, because again, each year we learn something new and something different as the world changes with what our supervisors need to know and do.
I suspect that some of the evidence that you're curious about would also probably potentially be able to be reported under OE 6.9. Indicator 3 there is the district provides staff development to support primary initiatives. Certainly, we're not only supporting, you know, your principal's license, but we're developing our principals, you know, in their skills above and beyond that to be as effective as possible. So I would imagine that would be a fine place to put some of that evidence, some of that reporting. You know, hey, so what are we providing for administrative trainings, or what are, you know, our staff trainings that could go there as well? That might be another place to fit it in, or that we could sort of, and if, you know, cross-reference or something like that. Commissioner Zur?
So I think the place, obviously 6.2, you got my email. And I think that the conversation has kind of addressed where I was stuck there. Listening to Executive Director Mark's talk and using that word culture as being key to recruitment and retention of staff. I I can't help but be slightly concerned that those indicators are not, I don't know that a staff climate survey can show the value of courage in our classrooms or in our culture, right? So I'm trying to figure out how do we actually measure our culture in a more thorough way? Like, I don't know that these indicators are going to be substantial enough or move the needle enough on a culture that really is thriving in the values listed here.
I'd agree, and that's the perfect part about having this, is that it's not just a one and done, it's kind of like a standardized test. You know, and then you get the educational autopsy and we get the results back 6 months later. Well, it's not so much with this one survey, but, and that's why I just spoke to Executive Director Schmidt beforehand too, just about some of the types of focus groups. I think focus groups are pretty important with this type of work with our employees, where they're not just taking a survey, but it could be a survey and it could be the protocols that I've learned in this district in a year and a half when speaking with employees or parent groups, get a lot accomplished in an hour and a half. But I think that can help far more. I think that initial survey that, for example, we took on staff climate last May is a good start, but I agree with you, it's not enough. Because as I go around to schools, and I hope I try my best to be very visible with our staff. I don't think I was as good as last year. And I could measure that by looking at my calendar. I was, at this point last year, I was probably at Manz 2 to 3 times over the course of the school year, and Principal Keaton would say that. This year, it's been once. That's easily measured. But in my communications, but also with the folks back there in meeting with groups, I think part of that would be, or part evidence could be, the meet and confers that we have, the ECA executive meetings that we have, from my standpoint, just as the superintendent. But also I think if Mr. Schmidt were able to talk right now a little bit about types of focus groups that have been done in the past, but I think we can get far more information and more evidence, he'd be able to help with it. Jim, are you able to discuss that a little bit?
Actually, you're right. I look back starting in 2013, we kind of did an alternating year where we did a staff survey in 13, and then in 14 we did the focus groups, and then just repeated that three rounds where we did staff survey 1 year, focus groups, staff survey, focus groups, staff survey, focus groups. Of course, in line with what Executive Director Mark said, pandemic kind of tipped some things upside down, so we did the staff survey again last year. And so probably have to make a decision about this year, what that will look like. Typically, a staff survey is about 2/3 of our staff, maybe a little bit lower in terms of responses. But you're right, we brought in focus groups. It's typically been looking at different, like bringing hourly staff and getting a mix, than to do like random polling of staff. Certified staff, looking at like early or elementary and pre-K secondary folks, try to get like different bands of staff in on those surveys as well. But try to make sure that we have a voice for all groups, and then really developing, typically, like you said, about an hour, maybe a little over that in terms of a session, a little bit of a warm up. We bring in an external facilitator, and then really try to dig in on what findings from the prior year tell us. And again, that's been some of the past practice. Doesn't mean it has to look like that moving forward. That's been the have been done before.
I would agree that indicator, or there should be more indicators added to that, make it more robust. So I acknowledge that, and thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I think what I'm hearing, and maybe this is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Clemens, but I think that what I'm thinking is that we need to dare greatly a little bit with some of the goals that we set within some of these things, because if the culture is at the root of recruitment and retention, right? If it's at the root of qualified and robust and all of these wonderful things, if that is really 6.1, right? It is at the top, it is very important. I think that we need to set a proactive indicator that we're going to try something that maybe we haven't done in the past. And I don't know I don't know quite what that is, that's not my area of expertise. But again, like if we set it and we fail, that's a, you know, a question I have is what does that mean? And because I mean, that could have implications across our governance policy, right? If we set goals that we're gonna fail at, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for you guys? And what does that mean for us? And I think it's important for us to consider when and where we do that. And if this is something clearly, we put a lot of value in this. So I'm just wondering if there needs to be like more meat with the potatoes, you know? I don't know how we get there, but kind of like that, put a stretch goal.
Commissioner Clements.
Thank you, President Nordine. Yeah, so I think that the culture and climate, although those things aren't explicitly mentioned in 6.1, you know, from an organizational development perspective, what I read about employment, especially right now, and I'm a little bit less up on educational outcomes, but it would seem that they're similar, that people work best when they're in organizations that have a great culture and have good climate, and those things rise above credentials, and those things rise above like an individual's preparation. It's like people who are in a organization that have positive culture are much more likely to stick around and much more likely to grow as employees, and I have some presumption that's similar for students. Morale and cohesion and things like that are likely, it would seem to me. Perhaps those who are education can refute or confirm, but that seems to be really important as to whether students feel safe and are going to grow to their potential in that ecosystem. But I don't know quite exactly how to measure that. I think it's really important. I think it's much deeper than a survey is going to be able to reveal, even if a survey is done monthly. Like, I think we actually need to talk to people in schools on a somewhat regular basis to figure out what is the climate, how is the culture, and what can we do better, or what's going on well that we can replicate. And that's going to be difficult because I presume there's going to be some diversity between buildings, even like what's the culture, what's the climate in a particular building. And what can the district do to replicate what's working, and try to work on things that aren't working. But that next to some of the presentations we've had in recent months about the student climate survey, that's kind of an outcome of what we should be working on cultivating here. But I'm not sure how to measure. But I think it is important that we make some effort determining how to do that. In a way that we can report to the board in terms of what's going on, because we're not in the schools on a regular basis.
I think it's somewhat similar to the student climate survey, where I know our principals had gone into their data a little more deeply when there was the original in September. Wow, like this data doesn't seem right. We need to dig down more deeply into our data at the school level and look at certain questions. What I looked at with our staff climate, there's like a question about I can speak to my supervisor, and I feel a trusting relationship where I can speak to my supervisor. But I look at Principal Keaton, and his data is really bad at Manz because his staff are really upset. They don't feel that they can trust him because, oh my gosh, he's this just mean over, but yet, just kidding, obviously. But wow, look at that achievement data. I mean, it's really interesting to see how, and again, to the public out there that's viewing and listening, that's not the case. And then I've got, obviously, when you can look more deeply into, let's say, at North Star, that question as well, where everybody loves Mr. Schooley. He's just like absolutely the positively the best. But once again, we stay curious, and then we look at the growth throughout. That can help But I think those are things that we can continue to dig more deeply in on. And I know Kim, as you know, supervising principals, is aware of that as well. You know, when she visits and she's out and about, I was at Meadowview last week and got to speak to some staff over there, and you learn an awful lot when you sit and you eat lunch with staff. The good, the bad, and the ugly. But you know, it's really interesting to do that. But I'm very confident that that's one thing I think we've done in this COVID world over the past 18 months. We've shared, you know, Mark Williams has shared with us that it's evident we're trying to be out in schools a bit more, and that's a good thing. So we won't know until we ask or we're there presently, and we can always get an email and sometimes a phone call, but sometimes it's really good to hear from people when we're out in the system. Again, to Mr. Scootley and to Mr. Keaton, thanks for playing along with this. I apologize, Mr. Keaton. That's not the case. Anyway.
Did you feel like you dodged a bullet over there? Yeah, Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, you know, I think for me, I'm really starting to kind of realize kind of where where my concerns lie. I think as we go through these operational expectations and with indicators and looking through all of these indicators, I share some of the the concerns about 6.2. That for me, if there's no indicator about like retention, 6.2 needs to actually be reworded entirely. I think from an employment standpoint and having to, we have data that would actually tell us how many people leave the district and how many people are hired in the district. That's an indicator of retention. And why does that particularly happen? I think retention has to be a part of that. I had some concerns about indicator 5, but now I think after listening to multiple individuals speak, I think overall the concern mainly about all these particular indicators, and we talk about morale, and we talk about the impact of the individuals who are in the school. A lot of these indicators, in some form or another, majority of our staff are familiar with. And unfortunately, majority of our staff who have been here for a while realize that actually these indicators end up this being something that they do, not necessarily having an impact on moving their work culture one way or the other. And I guess a suggestion that I would make is if we continue to rely on indicators that are available, I guess what I would like to see is kind of, since we already have these indicators, where are we at? Where do we need to go? Instead of actually I guess when I was envisioning that indicators that potentially will demonstrate that we are trying to move the needle in whatever direction, and also acknowledging that in some of these indicators, the needle won't move at all, but effort has to be there. My concern is with some of these indicators, pretty sure a lot of our teachers and staff have been taking climate surveys forever. UW Claire, we take climate surveys forever. Has the climate necessarily changed all that much? See, not in my 15 years, especially around issues as it pertains to D&I, we're getting better, but not so much. But in terms of morale and really when everything else is not going as well, morale is all staff have to hold on to, and keeping up the good fight. And so for me, I really think that with these indicators, so just if we were to just go back to, so you say 50% are, if I looked at indicator 6.2, indicator 1 and number 2, that's not really actually, that's not difficult. we'd probably maintain 100% because that's the majority. What else is there that potentially would essentially move the needle? And I guess for me, I realize now it's the indicators that have been chosen, they already exist. Have we been provided then? What's the current status of some of these indicators? And why would we choose to potentially move this indicator forward, continue utilizing, or should we actually do something completely different? And that's kind of where I realize now it's kind of part of my challenge as I look at a lot of these.
So here's one thing that I think that could help that I saw on one other of the districts, but I didn't include it. And I think just based on your comments and a little bit too is the part about the retention. If morale's good, you would assume that people are going to stay. One would assume that. Now, it was only in one of the other four that I looked at, but if we do have that data, but with 1,400 employees, I think if we had a rate of no more than 8 to 10% of people would leave the district from one year to the next. Well, is it typical, HR Director Marks, that we would have 35 to 40 retirees per year? Is that typical? Sorry, I put you on the spot.
That's okay. I would say typical is going to be are you talking only teachers or district-wide?
District-wide.
Yes, that would be about accurate.
So that would, go into that, let's say 10%, okay, 140. Well, we're going to have probably a third of that, or maybe it's slightly less, that would be retirees. So then how do we close that gap, get people to stay? And I think that would be a good indicator that directly addresses retain. But I haven't delved into that data. I've not asked Kay about that, but that was it seemed to be one indicator.
Commissioner Lyons.
So that's a very interesting point. I would like to drill down just a little bit more because the retention that I think is most important are not retirees. It's individuals that might be leaving to go to a different district and work. And it would be good to have those two populations parsed out, because for a retiree, that's kind of a celebration and it's a culmination of a career where I'm not sure that's the area we want to retain.
By level, by employee group, there could be all sorts of, if we saw certain type of a theme there. I think there are probably all sorts of areas.
Representative Loken.
For understanding culture, I see this as a very difficult yet extremely important problem. Currently, from my limited tenure, I have not seen rigorous enough mechanisms for day-to-day culture to reach the upper echelons of the board. I don't see ways where teachers or students can meet in a low-friction manner with anybody of importance that will present this in a timely manner to the board. To me, it seems important that on a weekly basis, the principals are meeting with each of the key stakeholder groups, the general staff, whether they're hourly or salaried, the teachers, and the students, to find out how they feel. I see that as at the high school level, during ELT time, a principal will go into one classroom and ask students, how do you feel? What do you think needs to be improved? The teachers, during the weekly meetings, sitting on one of the departments to find out how they feel. And then for the other staff, maybe it's eating lunch, maybe it's scheduling a meeting, but we don't know how these stakeholders feel right now. And I see that as a problem. And once that information is presented to the principals, I propose having that information sent to Superintendent Johnson and have that information presented to the board on a weekly basis. And possibly adding at the beginning of the board meeting a couple minutes just to discuss what feedback came up. So when we are discussing upper level policy, we can at least take into account how people are feeling. And I recognize that this would take some time, but the board is really serious about it. We need more actionable steps where people at the lowest levels can actually share feedback on what's going on for most of the people in the district.
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback that was, was given. I guess one of the concerns when we talk about focus groups and certain stakeholders, the cautionary tale for me is actually it always ends up being certain stakeholders, not all stakeholders, and however we move to potentially get feedback from stakeholders, if that's a movement, I think we have to ensure that all stakeholders have an opportunity to kind of share comments, and we know that it's typically those individuals who find themselves the most vulnerable are potentially the least heard, we have to be mindful of that particular piece, and I'm not sure survey responses and or focus groups, because how do invitations how are invitations sent to focus groups, how are focus groups selected. It was interesting last year when I went out to the majority of the elementary schools and all the middle schools and all the high schools, and having an opportunity to kind of meet with principals, other administrators, teachers, and even have an opportunity to talk to a few students. It was really, to understand that there was some hierarchical things that teachers kind of felt of not being heard. Especially, I was unaware of the perceived hierarchical structure that was that elementary teachers really feel at least heard as it relates to kind of what's going on. And so, if Superintendent Johnson, you and your group entertain this idea of trying to improve the voices of stakeholders, just remember that it should be all stakeholders, especially those who are feel the least among them, that their voices are heard. And then could I just wanted to address on that 6.9, that indicator 5 for me. I'm just curious in terms of I'm always weary as someone who served on evaluation committees of faculty and administrators, the kind of how one views the utilization of mentorship. And it's kind of could someone just could you elaborate just a little bit in terms of kind of what does that what does that entail in terms of and mainly I guess my concern is the selection process, alignment actually of a particular mentor with the mentee, the compensation potential structure that actually exists, but also is there some type of hierarchical aspect that also comes along. I know that was actually 4 questions in one. My apologies for it, but if you could, and the reason that I say that, I think at one point in time in my career, being mentored as a mentee, and now where I am 15 years later, I feel a little bit uncomfortable when I have some of my tenure track faculty say that I am a good mentor. Actually, I don't think I've mentored any of them. They asked me a question and I provided them advice. Versus there are some programs out there that are structured mentor to mentee programs that follow some types of procedures. So just any type of information on kind of how this mentorship program kind of looks like. And then do we find ourselves with the mentor to mentee ratios that potentially happens?
I'm just looking up real quickly if you can see if our site is still active. We actually do have, if you ever want to take a peek at some of the details, to you'd put the district's URL and then put /mentor. It actually has a summary of the program, but in a nutshell, for certified staff, when staff are recommended for hire, each administrator assigns a certified staff a trained mentor for that new incoming certified staff member. That mentorship lasts for 2 years. It can change if the mentorship relationship is not deemed as successful by all parties. Mentorship begins in August and it runs through June each of the 2 years. Staff are compensated, both the mentor and mentee, $100 per month if they put in the equivalent of a day's work. They can do it in half day or full day, or in terms of the compensation. So there is actually a large budget item actually to support that take place beyond the contract day that typically is part of trying to bring along someone new. So the principal, like I said, does look at the incoming staff person, look at the trained mentors that they have available to them, their staff, and try to make a match. There's usually an ongoing conversation before that assignment is actually made. And like I said, it takes place over a couple of years. And if you look at some of those materials, it has some recommended sequence of things for that pairing to focus on. Sometimes we will also, if we have someone in a specialized area, so for example, if we have a music teacher at an elementary school that's isolated, that person might get a mentor from their school in addition to a mentor from another school that actually has the content area as well. So sometimes we will, typically it's a one-to-one, but sometimes we will have 2 mentors for one person if that need exists, identified and agreed upon by all the parties. Been one of our, we did a renovation of the project of the mentor program probably about 6 years ago. I'm throwing a dart at, right around there. And so at that point, we actually required everyone who wanted to be a mentor to go through a 4-module training exercise. It's equivalent of 2 full days, or each module being a half day. So it's a pretty robust program. We've gotten a lot of strong feedback, both from those who've gone through the training and from our mentors and mentees. And we in the past have done some surveying too about to try to tweak that program as we move forward as well.
Thank you.
I don't know if that got all 4 questions, but I think I may have gotten.
And what was the way that you said we could get to that site?
If you put the district's URL and then /mentor.
Authorship.
And it should redirect you then to a site that has details to the program.
All right, thank you.
But I just basically, I give you just the in a nutshell, but you could dig in deeper there.
I think you said this just.
We actually have that on our public facing, because I know the human resources has used it before as a back to the recruitment conversation. This is one of those things that is a good incentive for us.
Just found it again.
Representative Loken.
In response to Dr. Johnson, I'd like to say that he's absolutely correct, where the mechanism I proposed definitely has the opportunity to be biased. But I'd like to ask the board, what are the challenges with putting something like this in place? There seems to be an emphasis on understanding culture, but not very many actionable steps.
So I'm going to take an opportunity here to do a couple of things. Want to maybe address a little bit what you're saying. That's part of what we're trying to do under our new governance model with the board, is have a mechanism by which to ask the administration to move the needle, right? Dr. Johnson, you talked about the actionable steps, to use Representative Logan's phrasing, that we may have had in place, but we don't always see feeling among the staff or on the district level that changes are occurring. we talked about how do we get all voices, and of course, that's one of the focuses of the board, and I will, remind everybody, including Superintendent Johnson, of course, that OE 2.7 requires that the superintendent invite, encourage, and amplify voices of historically marginalized communities in decision making. And that needs to permeate through all of the things that we undertake as a district. And if it's not happening in a particular area, it does fall to the board to hold accountable. Why are we not getting all stakeholders involved? Why are we not getting those who are most vulnerable, as you put it, Dr. Johnson, a voice in this particular procedure? And so we need to look for that in each of the things that we go through. As we move forward, Superintendent Johnson, I will recommend to you what the board really needs to see when we come. I think this is on our board calendar to come back for the formal monitoring report in December. I'm not sure which meeting. We'll look at it tomorrow in our agenda setting meeting. What the board needs to see is not only what is your assessment of where are we compliant, where are we meeting our goals, where are we not meeting our goals, or Dr. Johnson, if you can see it there on which meeting it is. I want to say it's the first meeting, maybe 6th of December. Correct. But when we are not meeting our goals, whether it's here or whether it's with, we recently just did the first monitoring report for R1. We know that not every academic success indicator in the district is where we want it to be. We know that we must move forward, and what the board wants to see, if I can speak on behalf of the board, is how are we going to move the needle? So where we have not made the impact that we want, be it in academics, be it in administration of personnel, be it in, what's the one that OE 12, keeping our insurance up. Welcome there, Commissioner Lyons. How are we going to move the needle? That's really what we need to see, because board members, we all have ideas. We take information from the community. Student representatives are hearing from students. I referred my son to Representative Berg with an issue the other day. We have ideas and we can give input, and we can feed what the community has let us know as ideas to you. But of course, you're the educational expert. Ones with you specifically, Superintendent Johnson, are the one that the board hires in order to move the needle. So I hope when we come back for OE6, and of course for all of these, that in the areas where you say we are not compliant, or the board finds that you are not compliant, how are we going to change that? How are we going to reach those things? That's what we need to see, is that forward look to how do we move the needle to impact, because of course what we know is of the things that the district can control, our teachers have the highest impact on student achievement and student outcomes. And our staff are probably a close second. I'm less familiar with that body of research. How do we move the needle? So as we go forward, what are your plans for improving the things? And we've talked many times. I know that you have plans and ideas. I know that you've been doing many of these things on our culture and climate, but the board needs to see that, needs to be presented that when we come for this monitoring report. So when we come back on December 6th, I hope that we will see not only an accurate assessment of where is the district on this OE, but how are we going to take the next steps? What are the plans to take the next steps? Because that's what we need, is action in the district to achieving those goals, whether they be for our staff or most importantly for our students. So what the board needs to do is make sure that the district is putting into place action steps to accomplish the goals that the board has set. And when the board has ideas, share them, of course. Ultimately, the responsibility for operating the district falls to the superintendent. And so the board needs to make sure that the superintendent is doing the job with the help of all of our staff, of course, and putting those things into place. So when we're recognizing we don't have as many steps as we might need, or there are other ways that we might need to look at it, that what we're doing right now is asking for, we need more steps, put them in place, bring us the results so we can tell whether or not they're working. So thank you for helping to encourage us on that. That I think is what we're all trying to do at this moment. Seeing no additional comments at this time and noting that we're just over our budgeted time, I think it's an appropriate time to move on. As we just mentioned, we'll have the full monitoring report scheduled right now, at least for December 6th to come back. The next item on our agenda is actually related to OE6. It is matters reserved for board action. Kay Marks will come and do a presentation on our COVID paid leave days for qualifying staff. In that this involves a potential change to employee benefits. The board has reserved that particular type of change for its own approval. We will hear that presentation tonight and the administrative recommendation. We'll have time to discuss and ask questions. We will have it presumably on the agenda for a vote at our next meeting. This does fall directly under OE 6.13 or board approval, and that's why we're hearing about it tonight. So Kay, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about a proposal for some COVID paid leave days for all staff in the district. A little bit of background about where we're at. So this year, we've looked at the needs of all staff in the district related to our absences. No big surprise, you know, coming into COVID, we already had an issue finding substitutes, you know, to fill absences. That's been going on for years across the state, across the nation, and COVID has only, you know, exacerbated that. So you can see that some of the data that we have in terms of staff COVID positive cases by month up until just the end of October, and then staff quarantine cases, again, just up until the end of October. There's a little note at the bottom saying that these numbers are the minimum possible cases, and that's just because we don't always have complete access, because sometimes absences are entered into our system in terms of, or through a manner that we're not aware at that point in time, that it's a COVID case. And so this is our best understanding at this point in time. So like I said, this is the minimum number. But based upon this, we recognize the fact that there's an ongoing need, just like there was last year. So what we did is we reached out to other districts throughout the state to see what's going on in other districts, what are other districts seeing, and if they're seeing similar things, then what are they doing, if anything? So you can see that there was multiple surveys that had been going on in the state, districts that were kind of in the same boat. We were just looking for data with, you know, neighbors. What are you seeing and experiencing? So out of the 29 districts who participated in different surveys, there were 9 who were offering some type of their own district created COVID paid leave days, because obviously we don't have anything from the government at this point in time. So a couple of examples that I listed there. You can see that one of them was up to 10 paid leave days to care for positive employees or their family members, or they could use any amount of those 10 days for childcare related to COVID closures, but only 2/3 pay would be for those 10 days. And that was at the Fond du Lac district. Both DC Everest and Hayward, who participated in the survey, had 10 days available, but that was only through 9/30 of 2021, which would tell me that those were probably carryover days from last year's program that they created, because that doesn't leave a lot of time for employees to use those 10 days. And then the 7 days that were available to only vaccinated staff in that program was through West Depew. So out of the 29 that participated, you can see that there were 9 who had offered some type of a leave. So when we decided that we needed to move forward, there were key factors that we wanted to make sure were included in whatever it was that the district came up with. So one of those key factors was that we wanted to make sure that we were encouraging vaccination. We wanted to consider whether or not the days could come from a donation bank, so that it wasn't just the district giving more days on top of things. So we considered that piece as well. We looked at determining a threshold of days that a staff member would need to have to be able to use that bank. So if we created another bank, could it be that a staff member who has 120 days in their sick leave bank now, because that's the max that you can hold, could that person be eligible to receive donations from a colleague when somebody else has 5 days in their bank? So that was something that we had considered if we went the donation bank route. Along with that, we also wanted to make sure that with the district-wide sick leave donation bank that already exists for catastrophic illness or injury, that this was very separate from that. And we wanted to make sure that that didn't muddy the waters. So that was another piece that we had considered in discussions. We wanted to make sure that this plan was available for both sick and quarantine purposes. We talked about the number of days that an employee would need per incident, that we would have needed to determine the process to request utilization or denial for approval or denial from the bank. And then how many times could an employee utilize the bank if we were going to go through the route of donations? And then finally, establishing a process to gather and house the vaccination status of staff members and their children. So these were all key factors that were discussed and considered when we looked at trying to come up with a process to provide employees some paid leave related to COVID. So option A was to, again, create the bank of donated COVID paid leave days available for vaccinated staff for instances of quarantine or positive COVID test of themselves or a vaccinated child. And then option B would have been to provide all staff with 10 district-supported days for vaccinated staff instances for either themselves, again, or their children. Again, in both instances, either the employee or the staff needed to be, or the child needed to be vaccinated. Again, that's if the vaccination is available for the children. If the child is of an age where they are not eligible for vaccination, then obviously that piece doesn't pertain, and the child would, or the employee would still be eligible for the leave if they have a child who is not vaccination age eligible. So these are the two different options that we had explored. And then what we did is we took the key factors that we had already talked about and kind of drilled down and looked at which of those options pertains to, or sorry, which of those factors pertains to option A and which of those factors pertains to option B. And so we went through and we assigned each factor to each of the options. And as you can see, option A had a lot more pieces assigned to it or requirements versus option B. And when we worked through everything and the capacity within the available staff in the district to make things happen and to make things happen quickly so that our employees could have the days available that they need, we opted to go with option B. And so the recommendation that administration is making to the board is that we provide all staff members with 10 district supported, or we would be giving them 10 additional days for vaccinated staff instances of quarantine or positive COVID tests for themselves or their vaccinated child, again, with the knowledge of the child being vaccination age eligible. This would pertain to all employees in the district. We would retroactive this would be retroactive back to July 1st, and it would be effective through the end of the school year. I know that there's been questions about, what happens if the age of vaccination changes, the FDA, if that should change. And at that point in time, the district would obviously just be flexible in providing staff members the time that they would need to be able to get children vaccinated. But we would still utilize whatever it is that the FDA approved age level is. So that's the proposal before you. I know that employees are eager to find out what the actual recommendation was. So I'm sure that they'll be happy to hear that the recommendation is that they're going to offer 10 additional days. They would only be eligible if the staff member needed them. Staff members will actually see them in their, their ASOP accounts, but they would only be able to access them in the event that they were, approved through the process. So that way an employee can, have total authority over how many days they would utilize if they met the eligibility. But at the end of the school year, if somebody didn't need them, those 10 days would be gone. They don't get to roll over into their sick leave, for the following school year. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Okay, thank you. I'm personally very happy that we have the opportunity to offer additional support to our staff over this year. We know that it's been another tough year, and makes me feel good that the administration is coming forward and saying we can support our staff in this additional way. So thank you for that. Comments or questions from 4K, excuse me. Start with Representative Loken.
My first question is about the statistics you had, I believe on the first slide, where there was COVID-19 days and quarantine days. To me, it appeared that COVID-19 days should be a part of the quarantine days. So I was wondering why the COVID-19 days weren't a part of the quarantine days.
The COVID-19 days were staff members who tested positive for COVID versus those who needed to be quarantined for close contact purposes.
Okay. And my second question is, why will the bank be separate from the total district sick days? In other words, what about COVID-19 justifies having it as a completely separate bank versus adding additional days to the existing sick bank?
So this isn't going to be a bank.
Okay.
That was something we considered, but because it was, there were too many steps involved in creating another donation bank and then asking employees to give to their colleagues for this purpose. We decided that wasn't the route we were going to go, and rather than doing another bank, the proposal on the table to the board is just for the district to provide up to 10 additional paid leave days for COVID purposes to staff members if they meet the criteria. So it's totally separate than any bank.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And the last quick question of, right now we are dealing with COVID-19, but in the future there will be similar infectious diseases. So would it be helpful to have the perception of this being a quarantine specific days, but not necessarily specific to COVID-19?
Are you asking me that or the board?
Sorry.
My response to that would be that, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I would say that pandemic is going to create unique and unusual circumstances based on that pandemic, and I would be hesitant to make a recommendation to the board that they should create a policy or procedure based on COVID-19 for something that we're not aware of and we haven't experienced for the future. My recommendation would be that we take each one of them, heaven forbid that we have, more of these in the future, that we would make a recommendation now based on something that, may happen down the road. We would wait for that occurrence to happen and then make a more educated determination based upon a situation.
Dr. Johnson and then Commissioner Lyons.
I guess I've always asked this question as we come back to this. Do you have an idea of the number of individuals that would benefit from the retroactive piece? I'm just always curious. Is it possible that someone's already, even with the retroactive, they're probably already maxed out to 10 days? Do we have individuals that would be?
Well, yep, I believe that there are people who are already in that boat, whether it's brand new employees to the district or it's returning employees who are starting the year with a zero balance. So I believe that there will already be people in that situation, yes.
Commissioner Lyons.
Thanks for the presentation, Director Marks. The 10 days is something that I really support for employees. At the crux of it, the county has set up a recommendation that if people get COVID, they are required to quarantine. And if you have COVID, it takes 2 weeks for that disease and the contagion to run through. If you're quarantined, it's a requirement. And, because nothing that the employee did has caused this, and yet they're required to stay home. And so they shouldn't be using, in my opinion, the sick time and or vacation time for something that's really outside their control. So I think that this is a great action. Where it gets a little tentative to me is then including the extended family and the children. And I really appreciate you answering some of the questions that I had that were, you actually mentioned some. The moving target on who is vaccine eligible and who isn't vaccine eligible. Children that in other districts and things like that. So you answered all of those questions absolutely to my satisfaction. The one last thing that I would ask is that there's always resources that are connected with these kind of decisions. And I know that trying to estimate what this is going to cost or the resources that are involved is kind of a guessing game because we don't know the utilization, we can't predict the future. But I think what we can do is at the end of this particular fiscal year, we can look at the number of days that were utilized, and we can, to some extent, look at the real costs that were associated with the replacement of staff, a substitute teacher that comes in, et cetera. So I support this, but I would like at the end of the day to know, after the board, if they do support this, what this, in any future instance that this might come up, what this kind of decision takes in district resources. So it may be a number of days that are utilized, and we have a count on the employee utilization of this, and then, to the best of our ability, what the resources were that were involved.
So all the questions that you have, all the reasons I said that I couldn't anticipate what this was going to cost, then in the end, not retroactively, but at the end, then going back and saying, "Look, couldn't tell you up front, but now at the end, here's what it actually did cost."
Great.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely not a problem.
Dr. Johnson?
To Commissioner Lyons' concern, as part of one of the federal funding mechanisms, we were reimbursed still for that initial COVID leave that was addressed in the previous academic year. Is that we were provided some funds that reimbursed us to account for that, correct? Or is that not the correct?
In the first semester of last year, we were required to provide the days. In the second semester, or after January 1st, we were no longer required to provide the days. In terms of whether or not there was a reimbursement on any of that for public school district employees, I do not believe that we had any kind of reimbursement come back to us, because I think the majority of that reimbursement piece had to do with tax exemptions for different employers, and because I just don't think it was to us.
Was there, I guess my question I'm at, was there a monetary amount to that data? Did we have calculations for?
Oh, how many days we used last year?
Yes.
I do not have that information with me. We able to gather that? I'm sure that if we dug into the data, we could, yes.
I'm just curious in terms of, potentially as, addressing some of those concerns about a final number, is there a way to see by going back and doing this voluntarily compared to when we had to particularly do that? Did we see, was there an increase in use or a decrease in use, and then whatever the monetary pieces that were associated with those amount of days? So I was just in a way of potentially, could we get to potentially a predictor of possible number of days based upon what was previously.
I think one of the variables that would probably be a significant difference between those two is going to be the fact that the vaccinations came in second semester. And when that happened, I think that we saw a significant decrease in the amount of absences of our staff in comparison to first semester. when we all know things were really bad. And a lot of districts in addition to ours. So the difference in absences between those two time periods is significant.
So based on expressions of support for this particular, I mean, this is something that the board extended that after January to continue that even when we were not required to, and this is in some ways an extension of a similar type of thing. I'm going to suggest that we just put it on the superintendent's consent agenda for next time. If there are objections to that from the board, please go ahead. I know I'll reach out to Commissioner Harder, who's not with us tonight. You go ahead and send me a message on email, and then we can put it on just an individual item next time. But hearing no one raise any significant concerns, I think we can just put it on consent. If that's the case, then that also sends the message right away to the staff that they know what the intention of the board is. Not hearing any objections to that, I'll just say thank you, Kay. And like I said, when we finish our agenda setting tomorrow, Superintendent Johnson will be able to report back to you, and I'll be able to report to the board where what we're doing. But we will see this on the agenda for next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we are only left with our regular board debrief. I will turn it over to Dr. Johnson to lead our board self-reflection on performance.
All right, so keeping in line with what we've been doing this academic year in terms of our board debrief, we'll talk about or identify things that went well and things that didn't, or where you are in this overall process. And we'll just start over at the end with Dr. Bika.
I think something that for me was most helpful about tonight was when actually you asked some questions that I think are the big questions. When you said we're using indicators, it's not just about MedZOE, but all of them. We're using indicators that we already have. So what does that mean? Did we all realize that we were going to use indicators that we already have? Did we know that? Or did we expect something different? To what extent do we think these indicators are going to change with each? I wonder what you all think about. And then you asked, when do we make a decision to take an indicator, move it forward, or when do we do something different, something entirely different? Those are the big questions to me. I want to know that about all of them because I wasn't able to anticipate really, what that experience really be like. But I can tell you that just from sitting here, this is the first time we experience as a board member that we're approaching this in a systematic way. And when you asked about mentoring, I knew. I knew what was going to be talked about just because we had a presentation one time a couple years ago on the importance of that mentoring program. But it's it was just hit or miss, I just happened to know that because of that presentation. But what this does is, it just makes it all like systematic. We're going to know so much more than this board has ever known before. But I am interested in those questions about the indicator.
Commissioner Clemens?
I think what went well is that we were able to have a discussion about how OE6 is going to be reported. Perhaps not unlike some of the other discussions that we've had, but I think we, as Dr. Bika mentioned, we started to peeling back the onion and saying, there seems like there's more here, or we're looking for more. And I think that is, for me, addressing some of the concerns that we've expressed before about this governance model, that some of the things that we care about we may not be measuring right now, or it may not be obvious how we're going to measure them. But really, those are the things that are really crucial, perhaps, are those things that are maybe that are difficult and not straightforward. So I really appreciate that we were able to get into that, begin to explore or continue to explore that. I don't think anything really was that positive about how our meeting wanted to think we stayed on schedule or even ahead of schedule, and yet we had, I think, a really good discussion, and both of those are positives.
One time, Commissioner Zur, and I don't remember if it was here in the meeting or if it was on a phone call, asked me, "Don't you ever have any questions?" Because I tend to go last, and I don't, ask all that many questions. And the thing I told her then, I think, was really evidence to me tonight that because sitting at the role of chair, I feel like it's my job to make sure that everybody else gets a chance to weigh in first. The questions and the comments and the directions and the concerns that all of you brought up tonight really hit home for me and made me, I was sitting here reflecting on, I don't have any questions, because each of you is reaching in and asking questions that I maybe had, and oftentimes pulling out things that I had not seen before. So in terms of what has gone well or a reflection on our board performance tonight, I'd like to thank each of you, and that includes our student representatives, for bringing just a wide array of viewpoints and ideas and thoughts about this going forward. I really feel, Dr. Beakey, you just said we're going to know and learn more than any board before us because of the systematic way they're approaching it. And I do feel like I've learned a lot tonight from each of you and your questions, and looking forward. And I like the opportunity for the board to be able to say to the administration, we need to move forward. We need to move that needle. We need to use what we have, not only to say, here's where we are, but to say, here's how we're going forward. So I'm going to hit that again. In terms of something that we'll need to improve, I'm actually looking to the future and thinking about, we have this robust discussion, and how will we manage when we have, looking at the calendar, we have almost every meeting from now on through the end of the year, the school year anyway. We have a final report and a first draft. And that's a lot of thought work and a lot of questions. And I believe that this board is up to the challenge of looking through that. There will be at least one meeting where we have 3 monitoring reports, 2 meetings at least where we have 3 monitoring reports at once to dig through. And that's going to put us to the test. So I don't necessarily think that we've done it poorly, but I see that as an upcoming challenge for us to continue to dig into that information early, get their questions in early, and bring the level that we think are trying to move to ourselves to do our part in the district. How do we stay on top of that when it's going to get busier and busier as the year goes on? Thanks.
For me, overall, I thought the discussion and conversation surrounding OE6 was very productive. Like I said, I had I guess you would say, an epiphany about like this whole process for me and where I'm struggling. And I also realized one of the things that we all should consider and holding ourselves a little bit more accountable to. I also realized the challenge of this view from up top as it pertains to policies. The impacts of policy take time. Education of our students and the support of our staff require, for the most part, some level of daily intervention. And that mismatch for me is a continuous kind of struggle. I'm not sure I have either the patience or the willingness to kind of wait to see the fruits of a policy, knowing that potentially on a daily basis, our students and our educators are being impacted in various ways that I think as a board, we're unable to potentially give them the assistance that they need. And so that's where I am. But I really, that conversation of OE6 really allowed me to kind of find this epiphany. John?
Thank you. I'll start with something that I think we should maybe think about doing better. And Commissioner Johnson pointed at OE 6.2 and made the statement, you know, this is one that we might need to completely rewrite. And being one of the people that was on the small committee that wrote these, I think he's right. Of course, the insurance ones I know are ironclad. But what is that process? So what is that process of how we as a board are tweaking these? I don't think we maybe thought about that. So I as you said that, I said, you know, I looked at it and thought, yeah, he's right. Who rewrites these or who tweaks them? And maybe that's a partnership between us and the superintendent, maybe, and it's a rhetorical question. So something to think about. Something that really went well for me, and it was really outside the meeting, was, and it's the way I think that things ought to go. I did receive the information on the COVID leave. I read it. I came up with some questions. Director Marks was good enough to supply my answers, so I didn't have to answer or ask those questions in this meeting. But at the same time, Superintendent Johnson sent the board my questions and some of those responses, which informed all of you of the things that I was asking, which I didn't send to you because I didn't want to have some semblance of walking quorum. So I got my questions answered. I felt like there was due diligence on my part. I received the answers from Kay, and I feel good about the decision. And at the same time, I felt like the communication flow was better, which I've struggled with sometimes because I think that there's so many barriers between us as a board talking and considering things that it was for me a positive thing.
Commissioner Hood?
So I think before this meeting, I sent President Nordine a text message and I said, hey, we've got this outstanding communication plan that we've not talked about. We should probably get that back on an agenda at some point. And it was really reinforcing to me that it popped back into my brain because of what Representative Loken said, and then what Dr. Bika said, and then what Dr. Johnson said. And it is that there is potentially, I think what we are seeing is sort of a, maybe we don't know what we don't know situation going on here. And it's really hard to determine what are those indicators going to be and what do we want to see when we don't actually see any of it. And I think we don't see the day-to-day workings of our classrooms, nor should we, but we do need to have some sort of mechanism by which we hear from those people in a more robust way. And I think that it is really imperative that we put our finger on the pulse of what is the culture of this district, and not just from a survey or a focus group or something that's delivered to us, but from the people who are living it every day. And how do we look those people in the eye? And how does that information reach us in an efficient, I think that was one of the barriers, in an efficient way. And so I look forward to getting back on that communication plan course and hopefully not getting off again for a while. But I think that would be really helpful for us to have something like that in place as a board. Something that I think went well tonight was, I'm going to echo what Commissioner Lyons said, is I think that I'm getting the hang of the process of looking at this and thinking, now granted, I sent my question to Superintendent Johnson much later than I wanted to, but the that kind of the rhythm of like read it and then I think about it and then okay, I've got some questions and I'm not going to waste time on that in a board meeting. It's something simple. It can be answered quickly. If you feel, if Superintendent Johnson feels the need to share it, it works really well because it informs us all and we come in here and we're efficient, we make better decisions. So, I think just getting the hang of the process is feeling really good for me.
Thank you. Thank you. At this time, I would hear a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Go ahead.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Adjourned.
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the Eau Claire Area School Board.